Welcome to the Altogether Show with Eric Satz. On this show, you'll hear Eric's unfiltered interviews with interesting and untraditional entrepreneurs who ignored boundaries and followed their instincts and own paths, and now empower others to do the same. Subscribe to the show and learn more by visiting altogether.show. And now your host, Eric Satz.
You gotta love someone who will do whatever it takes despite the unexpected obstacles that get thrown in their way. This week's guest on the Altogether Show is the affable Miguel Armaza, co-host of the Wharton Fintech podcast, which he and his colleagues have built into one of the top 5 financial podcasts in the world. I hope you enjoyed this show and learning more about Miguel as much as I did.
This episode of the Altogether Show is brought to you by Alto IRA. Alto is a digital, self-directed IRA company modernizing IRA investing. They make it easy and cost-effective for individual investors to access their retirement savings and invest in alternative assets. To learn more, visit altoira.com.
Miguel Armaza, welcome to the show, the Altogether Show. Really excited to have you here.
Thank you.
You're welcome. This is like home and away. I mean, I was your guest just 2 days ago, and now you're my guest here. I think you're the youngest. I think you may be the youngest guest to date, but you're old hat at this. You've been co-head of the Wharton Fintech Club and podcast now for quite a while, enough to do 70 episodes. And you're getting ready to make a transition from angel investor to professional investor with Gilgamesh Ventures. All of that's kind of, very formal in nature. But if I just say to you, who is Miguel? What's your answer?
Well, Eric, first of all, thank you for the invite. I know you have just a fantastic roster of guests, so I'm really honored to be here. It's, for me, the question about who I am, it always brings me back to talking about cultures and several countries, because that's kind of how I grew up, right? So family is originally from Bolivia, but the reality is I wasn't even born in Bolivia. I was actually born in Italy, in the beautiful city of Rome. But I didn't really live there long enough. My dad had a job that took us around the world. And so my upbringing has been kind of like what's now defined as third culture kid, but that's a new thing. Growing up, I just, I didn't know. So I was born in Italy, always moved back to Bolivia in between, but I ended up spending several years living in countries like Russia, like China, like Uruguay, always in the capitals, right? And always going to public schools, right? Some sort of version of public school. So in Russia, we get there and my parents realized that, international school, IB school was way too expensive. So they enrolled me in the local public school. And at the time, of course, as a kid, that can sound a bit challenging or extremely challenging, but you're adaptable as a kid. So I adapted and I got to start learning Russian with Russian native speakers at age 5 or 6, right? And so I spent several years there. And then when we lived in China many years later, this time as a young teenager, it was kind of the same story. The IB, the international school, was way too expensive. Well, turns out there's a Russian school in Beijing. How about you attend that school? And, I want to let it be clear that school was not for Latin American students. That school was for Russians living in Beijing. But they were very kind enough to admit me. I still had most of my Russian speaking skills. I had lost a lot. But I gained it back. And honestly, it has stayed with me ever since. And so we kind of have that theme, and my only constant was my family, right? Because other than that, I had to go out and always adapt and always try to meet new friends, learn a new language. And that has obviously pros and cons. I believe it has more pros than cons, but that very much depends on the personality. And, I eventually decided to move to the US for university. But coming to the US is not easy, particularly if your parents don't know much about the system, right? My brother was here, so he was starting to pave the way, but he was also extremely new. So I graduated from high school in Uruguay, and I came to the US really not knowing anything about the system. And so I actually started in community college, had 2 years in Houston, 2 fantastic years, plenty of opportunities, plenty of doors were open to me. And I used that to jump to Houston, to New York. I'm sorry. And I used that to jump to DC, where I graduated from American University. I loved my time there. Extremely cosmopolitan university and city, of course. And I wanted to continue an impactful but also global career. I did not grow up in a business-oriented family. So to me, learning about the corporate world was extremely important. And I first had my internship and then was accepted to join Citigroup in New York. And the main reason why I was interested is because I joined a program that had the promise to take you around the world, right? So I was fortunate to be one of those that got to work abroad. And after 2 years in New York, there was an opportunity to go to Dublin, Ireland. I raised my hand, and I never thought I would live in Dublin, but I found myself there for an entire year, right? I never drank so much Guinness in my life, but the Irish
There are worse things. There are worse things.
Yeah, I think I went to their museum and brewery a few times. And, I always knew I was going to come back to New York. This is definitely, for me, it's the best place, particularly if you know the background of my global outlook of the world. New York really has it all, and it doesn't matter where you're from, right? So came back here, worked for a few more years with Citi, then switched to a different bank, a Japanese bank. But I remember when I was in Dublin, I was so happy because I was able to pay off my student loans from American University. And I was so happy, and I started telling everyone around me in the office, and no one would understand. Why? Because turns out you don't pay for university in Europe. Right?
Unless you're from America going to university in Europe, then you pay big time.
Absolutely. Just like international students pay big time in the US. Absolutely.
That's right.
Absolutely. And so I realized, after that, I started, putting away some money to just start building a little bit of savings. But then working within large banks really opened my eyes to the opportunities of the financial sector. And the fintech story that I started to hear on and on as I was coming back to New York, the fintech story really made sense, right? And so I decided to, try to find opportunities to invest in fintech. And, that's what I did with my initial savings. And over the last almost 5 years, I've managed to build a small portfolio of fintech companies, both in the US and Latin America, right? And so when I applied and was very fortunate to be accepted to Wharton and the Lauder program, it's a dual joint degree, I knew that I was going to come in focusing on fintech, right? And particularly VC investing. And so I joined Wharton, the most amazing school and program you can ever find. And I also at the same time discovered the Wharton Fintech Club, which is also probably the strongest or one of the strongest fintech clubs from schools, right? And I started getting super involved, and I realized we had this outstanding podcast, right? It was always great. We were always having amazing guests, but I realized we could add a little bit more spice to it. And myself with a team, it's not me alone. We have an amazing team of students. We started building it from having two people per month on average to now publishing 3 to 4 per week, and publishing really, really good quality entrepreneurs and investors from all over the world, right? Coming back to those roots, the US is great, but some of the most interesting fintech companies are outside of the US. And so we started featuring some of those founders and investors from every region you can think of. And along with that, continued the sourcing, I guess, for fintech angel investing. And we realized, along with my partners, that there was this opportunity during COVID to actually find amazing companies, but also raise a little bit of money. So that's what we did over the summer. We've made 2 investments already, one in the US, one in Latin America. And we're looking forward to actually continuing to fundraise. And just the fintech opportunity is so large, and there are too many great entrepreneurs to let it pass.
So, in 3 adjectives, who are you?
Yeah, that was a lot more than 3 adjectives.
No, I mean, that was super background and understanding of your life experience. It's perfectly understandable how you've come to have such a global macro perspective, because you've lived in so many countries and so many cities. But if I give you 3 descriptive words to use to put by your name, to put on your tombstone, what are they?
Well, definitely, I have to start with optimistic. Right? I'm just an optimist by nature, and I try always to look at the bright side. Right? I'll start with that. Then resourceful. Growing up, if you're thrown into a foreign environment where you don't understand really most of the words that are being spoken to you're going to be pushed to be extremely resourceful, and that has stayed with me for really every day. I kind of wake up thinking, how can I make the best out of what I have, rather than looking at what I don't have. And then the last one is, I'm very loyal. I'm very loyal to my friends and family. Extremely important.
So let's talk about your family some more. How many siblings do you have?
I have 2.
So you have 2 siblings, and you're the youngest, is that right?
That is right. And I always got away with, with being a little bit more adventurous than my siblings. That's definitely the benefit of being the third.
Did they make it easier for you as you went from new country to new country?
No doubt. No doubt.
How so? Tell us about that.
Yeah, because if you are going to a new place, right, and everything is brand new, you can always look up for a sense of security to your siblings, right? My sister or my brother, they did not have that. So they had to, there was no line of defense, right, in between them and the rest of society, right? But for me, it was always through them. There was that sort of filter. And it was also, honestly, a filter between them, between my parents and myself, right? That was also a big deal. My parents were a lot more relaxed when I would venture out into Beijing by myself than they were with my siblings in Russia in the 90s. And now, that being said, Russia in the 90s was not an easy place to live in.
Tell us some more about your parents, and where are they?
So my parents live in Uruguay, Montevideo. It's a extremely nice country, stable, a great place to retire. Right. So my dad, the reason why we travel so much is because he worked for the foreign service of Bolivia, right? And obviously I share a lot of his qualities, and he's very resourceful, and in a country like Bolivia, which unfortunately it's the poorest country of South America, or one of the poorest in Latin America. He was able to really every 3 or 4 years find this amazing jobs that took us around the world. And my mother, she's just the best, right? She's the sweetest person I know, and she really kept the family together as we moved from country to country, because that's always not easy. You have to pack up and go and find schools for everyone, make sure that we're feeling protected, and then make sure that everything's in place. So clearly, I am a huge fan of my mom.
So as I think about culture, food plays an enormous role, I think, in every culture. But especially when I think about Latin America or Hispanic culture and the role that food plays. And I think, and I don't know this for sure, but I suspect that a significant percentage of current income goes to fresh food and preparation of fresh meals, maybe more so in Latin American communities than others. I don't think I'm making that up, but it's possible that I'm making that up. So with that in mind, what role did food play for you and your mom and your family as you moved around the world? Was this important to her, and how did she adapt?
Food always plays an extremely important role, and that's
right.
I think it's really oftentimes the glue of society, right? And for us, starting with our time in Bolivia, I always remember sitting around the table for lunch and dinner, right, as a family. My mom is an amazing chef, but along with her mom or just family members or friends that would join, and then it would be such an obvious thing to do, to cook and then share that meal together. But then, of course, you move, and there are ingredients that you cannot find for that food that you're used to, right? But if you think about the flip side, now there are new things that you have at your disposal, right? Some ingredients in Moscow or in Beijing that would not be available to you. So I always remember our dinner table will gradually change, and there'll be new meals. There'll be combinations of Latin American food with Russian food, with a mix of Chinese, right? But I guess something that was always nice and a constant for most of the time was sharing that meal at least once per day as a family, right?
Did food help break down barriers and language walls that may have existed with your neighbors and or schoolmates as you moved around? Would you go to a friend's house and get exposure?
Yeah,
How did that work?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You're just as you're asking, I'm reminded of several friends that I had from the Middle East, and I remember I had this friends from Afghanistan. This was in the mid '90s or early '90s in Moscow, and we would go to their place and we would sit down on the floor, and just traditional Afghan setup with the traditional food, and we would eat with our hands. And a lot of that, was a bit or very much foreign to me, right? But seeing all of them enjoy it and act in a way that, for them it was normal, it also showed me at a very young age that was normal in some places, right? And in many places. And so seeing that at an early age really becomes important. And same goes for friends from other parts of the world. Again, I remember in China, had this friend from Algeria, similar situation, and it was always new things. So I also became very comfortable trying new things, right? And that's oftentimes started with food, right? But sometimes it was in other areas of my life, right? But definitely being a yes person and trying new things, you kind of have to become that way to make friends with people from cultures that you've never interacted with before.
So that's interesting. Is there a food where that stands out for you where you thought, oh my God, this is going to be terrible, and it turned out to be delicious? And then another one where you wish you just never put it in your mouth?
That can get me in trouble with a lot of friends. But I can tell you one experience that I remember. The first time I was exposed to McDonald's, which I don't know if you call that American food, but I guess it is American food. It represents a lot
I'll
of
call
American.
it fast food.
Yeah. and so it was in Moscow. That was the first time, and it was I believe it was the opening of the first McDonald's in Moscow, or around that time. I'm not sure if it was the first or one of the first, but this is a country that was just exiting the Soviet Union, and so the demand for this McDonald's was insane. You would see the lines just around the corner and beyond for blocks, and this wasn't the summer, okay? This is cold Moscow, and people are waiting in line, and so we of course also stood
For
in line.
Big Mac.
Yeah, for Big Mac and fries, absolutely. But that was the first time I tried McDonald's, and I gotta be honest, I enjoyed it. I wasn't sure what to think.
I honestly don't know anybody who doesn't, right? Should you eat it every day, every meal? I think not. We've all seen that movie. Not a good idea. But can you enjoy a Big Mac? 100%.
Absolutely.
So I sent you a questionnaire before coming on the show, and I ask a bunch of random questions, one of which is side preference. And you said both. You didn't pick left or right. You said both. What were you thinking when you gave that answer? What did side preference mean to you?
Yeah, for a lot of people, it can mean different things, right? For me, it was pretty simple. It was two things. One, where you sleep, right? You sleep on the right or left. But also, just in general, I like to look at both sides of whatever we're talking about, right? I like to understand both sides of the argument, because I think usually not one person or not one side is completely correct, right? Usually there's a little bit of truth on both sides. Sometimes, of course, it's black and white, and then you know that one side is just factually correct. But most of the time, there's a lot. We live in a gray space, right? You have to understand both sides, and I tend never to be fanatical about anything I do, because it's hard for me to really say, okay, I'm only going to stay on the left side for whatever that means, and this is where I am. I think you're really closing yourself to a lot of what's going on in the world, and that's kind of how I grew up, right? Like you switch environments, and you realize what you knew for the longest time is actually very different elsewhere. And so coming to the US 13 years ago or so, I've always maintained that point of view, right? There's never one thing that's completely right or completely wrong. You have to analyze and then make your own decision. So yeah, that's what it meant to me.
So I'm going to come back to the what side do you sleep on thing in a second, because that's very, very important. But does this desire to look at both sides of a story or a question or an answer, does that make you a better investor?
Yeah, absolutely.
Why?
Well, because you need to understand the marketplace, right? And you need to understand. I mean, there's so many things to consider, right? But you need to understand the good reviews of a company and the bad reviews. Where are they coming from, right? And you need to understand both sides of the market. What are customers thinking? What are your partners thinking, right? You need to understand. If you consider both sides, you're always gonna have a more informed opinion, right? It's to me, it's unthinkable that you would make a decision based only on one side of the argument. It's almost like flying blind.
So does it make it easier or harder from a decision-making standpoint to marry what you're hearing on both sides?
I mean, it's going to require more work for sure, right? But if you are data driven, right, and if you follow your protocol, your criteria, what you're comfortable with, right, and then you compare that with the data, I think you're going to make a better decision. But there's no doubt that it's more work, right? But that's how the industry works. You have to really do your work and do your homework, and then have real due diligence, right? And so absolutely, it makes it a bit more challenging. But also, you need a great team where you deliberate and then you get to an informed decision.
So for the listeners out there who don't have a team to bounce the ideas off of, what do you suggest they do when they're thinking about making an investment? And should they look for somebody else's process to follow, or should they be thinking about creating their own?
There's definitely a lot to learn from those titans of the industry, people who have paved the wave and have been very successful. But you absolutely 100% need to figure out what works for you, right? That's something that is a must, because if you're gonna be copying someone else's method and decisions, then what's the fun in all that? And also, when you make a mistake, how are you gonna be able to own up to it, right? If you're just copying. And then to the first part of your question, I always admire solo entrepreneurs, people who without co-founders, because it can be a very lonely road, right? That's why I think a solo entrepreneur needs to be someone who's a very strong entrepreneur. But none of the successful single entrepreneur, solo entrepreneur, made it without some outstanding advice, and they surround themselves with really strong informal or formal boards of advisors, right? And they really recognize their flaws, and they seek advice from people they respect and admire to complement for those weaknesses and flaws. So, and that's kind of what everyone should follow, not just entrepreneurs, but everyone. You should. And sometimes this can be your friends, right? It doesn't have to be a formal relationship, but we all have a friend who's a lawyer, or we all have a friend who has had exposure to some area that you're trying to understand. So the name of the game for me is asking for help. Right? You have to be comfortable asking for help. And to me, I mean, I'm still pretty young. As you said, I'm the youngest guest of your show so far. But something that I always try to do is asking for help. And then that's how people have opened a lot of doors for me in the US. I mean, I love this country because there's just so many people who have opened their doors. But it wasn't because I was sitting waiting for that help. I asked, and I gave them a reason to open those doors.
I think you're touching on something that I like to talk about a lot, which is agency or ownership of your future. And what I think is also important to recognize is that we don't live in a country with a level playing field. It's not fair. And yes, I think we can all do things to make the field more level. But to the extent we can, we need to figure out what we can do for ourselves and to take that proactive approach and ask, and which is really hard to do. I mean, it's really hard to do. But I think if you want to have some ownership or agency over your future, it's a required skill and one that can be learned. So when you get in bed at night at home, do you get in bed on the same side every night?
That's such a good question. Yes. We're all creatures of habit at the end of the day.
We are creatures of habit. And so now I happen to know that you like sitting in the window seat on an airplane. Does it bug you that you can't see out the other side?
When they have the good view, it very much does. And it's a lottery. You never know. You never know. I guess extremely frequent flyers would know.
So you created a Facebook comedy page in 2009, and you grew it to like 3 million followers. Tell us about the creation of the page, why you created it, and what happened.
Yeah, that's I don't talk about that a lot just because it doesn't come up too much in conversation.
Time to talk about it.
So this was 2009, if I'm not mistaken, right? I was looking at what was going on in Facebook, and I've always had a few examples around me of people that I admire, and at that point it was a few tech entrepreneurs that I was following. And obviously, Facebook always a big tool for people's success. And I noticed that Facebook pages that were up until that point, they were just floating around. You had a page, and if a user liked the page, then they would click on a button, and on the user's profile, you would see that they liked that page. At that point, it was called fan, that they were a fan of that page. But there was nothing else. You could not broadcast as a page administrator to your entire user base. But that all changed one day, 2009, around April or so. And the day after it changed, I realized these pages that had millions of followers, millions of fans, all of a sudden, with a click of a button, they were reaching to all their followers. So obviously, huge shift if you think about it from a commerce point of view. And all of a sudden you could turn something viral almost with the click of a button, right? I mean, quality, of course, still matters and spontaneity, but you have a huge leg up if you have the distribution figured out. And so I was like, oh, this is interesting. I like watching funny videos, right? Who doesn't? And so I created this Facebook page, and I invited everyone I knew, which wasn't a lot of people. And I think it got to 50 likes or 50 fans on the first day.
Huge.
And I go to bed, and we were up to 100. I was like, oh, that's interesting. I don't know like 40% of that people. I wake up the next day, it's 200. I was like, oh, that's nice. I don't know 90% of those new 100 fans. And then from then it just started to double and triple on a daily basis until I remember, I think it was 10 days later. I was walking to class and I checked my phone, and it was at 210,000 within 10 days. And I thought to myself, this is amazing. This is incredible. But I have to do something about it, because two things were happening. We were growing very quickly. We started reaching 40,000 new members every day. And I would be very diligent. I would post once a day a funny video, like a kangaroo, pushing someone into a lake or things of that nature. And so on one end, we were growing, it was great. But on the other end, I knew Facebook's terms. They did not allow for generic pages. Pages were aimed at businesses or celebrities or that kind of organization or brand. And so I thought to myself, well, if those are the rules that Facebook has, and I'm going to lose this page one day or not until they notice me. So might as well take advantage of it. And seeing the growth and seeing that I had an audience that was just asking for silly videos, I started reaching out to some like key people. And one of those was the executive producer of the show Wipeout. I think most people know Wipeout. I think it was on ABC, huge national television show. And I explained, listen, this is what I have. I have a growing audience. They want people falling into the mud. They love that kind of video. He responded within 15 minutes. So excited. He said, listen, I don't control our advertising budget, but I'll use my own money to pay for some campaigns, and let's see how we do. And their Facebook page at that point had 15,000 fans or 20,000 fans. And we started posting, like once every couple of days, their ads or some clips of the show, the funniest ones. And people liked it. Some people didn't. We would lose some, of course, but we were losing far less than what we were gaining. We're gaining 40,000, we're losing 5,000, right? So to me, this all made sense. And then I started to get contacted by major corporations who had ads that fit our ethos, if you will. And, the whole thing lasted for 2 months. And I definitely made a lot more money than I would have thought as a college student. I ended up connecting with some amazing people, right? But then I lost it all because Facebook realized that this was getting out of hand, and they didn't just shut me down; they shut down other page administrators. We kind of knew each other at that point, and that was always I guess a chip on my shoulder, because I used it to get jobs later. I used it for interviews and dinner or happy hour conversations. But I always thought like I could have done a lot more. I mean, this happened so quickly, and I was young. But looking back, I was like, I probably could have done more. but it was a great run, right? And I found some.
But here we are, 11 years later. You're in your second year at Wharton. You've gone to business school. What would you have done differently?
I I probably should have built a parallel site and direct the audience into that site and get them as subscribers through their email and not their Facebook site. So again, what was the big mistake? I'll be consistent. I'll go back to what I just talked about. I did not ask for help. Right? I shared it with a few people, but for some reason I kept it private from most people, right? And so had I asked for, and I had some smart friends, definitely a lot of friends smarter than me, I did not ask to have like a brainstorming session to think about how could I seize this opportunity, right? Something as little as that, like let's use 30 minutes with 2 or 3 different friends and think about what can we do about this. I am convinced that the result would have been maybe even more long-lasting.
The conversation is actually incredibly topical because the idea of building a business on top of somebody else's monopolistic platform is very much in the news today, right? I'm of course talking about Apple's App Store and same thing for Google and Google Play, right? And the companies that rely on distribution and how Google and Apple, take their share in terms of a toll. And so you clearly weren't the only one to get hurt by Facebook. There were some much larger businesses who thought they would have negotiating power with Facebook as a platform, which just didn't turn out to be the case. So I think from an entrepreneurial perspective, you got to think twice about distribution for sure, and what it means to try and build a business on top of somebody else's monopoly.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned distribution. I think that's extremely, extremely important. It's probably even more important than the product, right? If you have no distribution, your customers are not going to hear from you, right? And that is actually, I like this point a lot because I lived through it, right? The rules have changed, by the way, now, because now Facebook is flooded with meme accounts, right? But just, again, going back to timing, right? Sometimes the success of an entrepreneur just depends on the right timing. And my timing was very early.
Timing plays an enormous role. Yes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I'll tell you what, I did learn a ton, and I learned lessons that I never forgot, and I've applied them to the podcast, right? I think...
Tell us about that. What was it? What are the lessons you've applied to the podcast? And by the way, walk us through the team's marketing approach. How are you the number 2 or 3 fintech podcast, I think, in the world? Is that right? Or is it
depending on the day. If you go to Apple Podcasts and you look for fintech, we show up as number 2 or 3 in the chart.
Nice.
So, obviously, it's a crowded market, and you have a lot of very, very high quality podcasts out there. So, to keep that kind of level, you have to be extremely active. So I think the lessons are you need to be consistent and active. Every time I would post on that Facebook page, with a set schedule, and I'll be very consistent, that would work. And users would know at what time or when to expect a funny video. So I've kind of, we've taken the same approach with the podcast. We publish 3 or 4 times per week, right? We're probably going to increase that, but we are consistent. There isn't a week where we're not publishing at least 3 times. We're always bringing the audience high quality guests, right? And the reason why we get to do that is because we cover the entire globe, not just US fintech. But then going to the distribution part, we already had very strong social media pages across multiple platforms, but we have made it even better. I think every generation of Wharton improves things a little bit, right? And I'm sure next year whoever's running it will make what I've done look like something that was small, but we have paid a lot of attention to building up our follower base, and we're making sure that we're targeting the right people. So, there's a platform for everyone, but turns out a lot of fintech people are in LinkedIn and Twitter. So we have started being a lot more engaging in both of those platforms, right? We are responding to every message, we're participating in the conversation, particularly that's going on Twitter on a daily basis. Right? And we are also starting to add some bells and whistles to everything that we publish. So for the most part, in most of our stories, we're writing a blog post along with what we publish, right? Not that it wasn't being done before, but now it's even more, right? So we're doing all that to educate our audience on what's going on in the fintech space, which is a lot. It's impossible to cover everything. But at the same time, we're being very strategic and targeted as to how we build our distribution capabilities. And, I've also created a newsletter that goes in parallel with the podcast. So every time I publish an episode, I have a newsletter. It's called Fintech Leaders. It's a LinkedIn newsletter, but, within 3 months, 5,000 subscribers, which is amazing. And I don't know most of these people, 99% of them. But all of that is driving more engagement and is driving more interest from our audiences. And last thing I'll add is going back to the international piece, by highlighting the strongest entrepreneurs and investors in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, in Africa, in Europe, we're also gaining those audiences. So now if we look at our stats, 60% of our listeners are US based, but the rest are global listeners. And
congratulations. That's
Thank
incredible.
you. And they're tuning in because they listened to that interview with Nigerian investor, or they're tuning in because they listened to that Argentinian entrepreneur and they liked it and now they want more. But we would not have captured them, as listeners, had we not gone to their local market in the first place.
So, have you had any controversial guests on?
Not really. We try to stay away from controversy. I mean, of course, controversy can drive a big audience, right? But our role, the goal for us is to feature strong entrepreneurs or subject matter experts, and sometimes they're investors, sometimes they're not, that are doing extremely interesting things within the fintech space, right? And this is a platform for them to share their story while educating our audience. So I guess, we've made a very conscious decision to an even better job on diversity, and that's diversity across the board, any way you cut it. And that generates some conversation. With openly in the conversation, we've admitted, right, how low our numbers at some point were, and so that generates some interesting conversation. Talking about the gender gap, but I don't think that's controversial. I think that's very accepted these days, and it's about talking on how to improve going forward.
So you mentioned Argentina. I've got to ask you about a carajillo. Where is that drink from and what is it?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked.
I'm guessing at Argentina, by the way. So I don't know.
No, actually, no. So carajillo is a drink that is originally from Spain, right? But at least in New York, and I think in other places as well, it has not been popularized by Spaniards. It has been popularized by Mexicans. So carajillo is an outstanding drink. It has licor 43, which is a Spanish liqueur, plus a shot of espresso along with ice. And, or traditionally, this is what fishermen will drink when they would go out fishing at like 3 or 4 a.m. in the morning, right? But now we're drinking it, at all times. And there are two places, they have the same parent in New York that serve it, called Atla and Cosme, outstanding restaurants. But the food is great, but the carajillo is even better. And I actually, one of them.
Does it go with duck carnitas?
Oh, of course it does. Yes, absolutely does. And in fact, they were telling me a story that the factory manager was wondering, like, what the hell are they doing in this restaurant in New York that they keep ordering boxes and boxes of our liqueur 43? No one orders that much. And so they called them, and the distributor got in touch with them. And they told him, listen, it's because our carajillo is the best in the world, right? And they actually flew here, and they wined and dined the restaurant managers. So it's also quite popular across Mexico. You go to Mexico City, you go to any other city or town across Mexico, and you'll find some amazing carajillo, and always wakes you up. So that's also extra nice.
So, as I think one of the core values at Alto is this idea that you do you, and which means that we each need to be our own best selves, or strive to be our own best selves. It's really hard when we don't do that. Has there ever been a time where you haven't sort of followed your internal compass?
Yeah, of course. I think growing up, like when you find yourself in an uncomfortable situation, first of all, your guard is going to be up, right? But then if you don't speak the language on top of that, then you're going to hide, or you're not going to show your true colors. Your personality is going to be different, right? So that was something that I definitely experienced in new places, right? Now, I'm a little bit lucky, or because I experienced that growing up, right? And I learned how to deal with it. I learned how to find things in common with people, how to navigate a new culture. So when I came to the US at age 18, 19, for the most part, I was able to navigate the environment, and although I was new, I still felt comfortable in my own skin, right? Fortunately, I did speak the language. I mean, I learned English at a very, very young age, but still, navigating a new place is challenging. So I think it's been mostly a function of language and culture.
So, as we wrap up, you almost ran out of money trying to finish college. How did you remedy that situation?
Yeah. Well, it's funny you asked that, but yeah, it's true. So I had my internship in New York before my senior year. So that's the summer when I was a rising senior, and I did well. I got the offer, but they don't pay you until you actually join. There's a small incentive before, but nothing that would move the needle in terms of student debt, right? And I didn't know what I was going to do. I just kept seeing my bank account going down and down, until one day the bill came in, and I had no money to pay. I believe it was for my last semester in college. And until I paid that, they wouldn't let me take my finals in the first semester of senior year. And so initially, I growing up in China, you find some amazing things that you can buy. So my family bought some like rugs that would cost a couple $100, but then there's an arbitrage. You go to a different market and it costs a lot more. So I had some of that, and I reached out to anyone that I knew who was wealthy to sell these things, and no one paid attention, right? I was getting more and more desperate, and I realized probably need to ask for help. And so I went to the dean of the finance department, Mr. Ronald Anderson, who is now the dean of the Temple Business School. And I just explained to him what was going on. Listen, I told him, I have a job and I'm going to be able to pay for student debt. But right now, as an international student, you have no access to student loans. So I couldn't even ask for a loan. This problem doesn't happen for an American student because, you just go to the bank, go to your savings and loan institution and you get a loan. That was not a possibility for me. And so I explained to him, and he just made one phone call. He didn't say anything. He picked up the phone, called the CFO of the school, and with one phone call, they let me take the test. They let me graduate, and they told me your debt will be there. It will be accruing interest, but you pay whenever you can. And I was able to do it.
It pays to ask.
Oh my God. And also it pays to have people who believe in you. Right? Had he not made the call, I honestly have no idea what would have happened. And of course, without a graduation, without a degree, Citigroup or whatever bank out there wasn't going to take me.
That was a big phone call.
Absolutely. Meant a lot. I'm not sure he knows, but I'll send him this.
I think a note would be well received. Yeah. So, Miguel, it's been a pleasure getting to know you over the last week. As I mentioned at the outset, we kind of did a home and away here. I was on your podcast, by the way, still trying to figure out why you wanted to talk to me, but glad I could do it. And just really enjoyed getting to know you and hear your story, and right away wanted to have you on the All Together show. And so for a closing statement, if you will, for those who are wondering how they get started investing and analyzing opportunities, is there 1, 2, or 3 things that you would say somebody should keep in mind as they do it?
Yeah, well, Eric, the pleasure is all mine, first of all. And you know that I've followed you and Alto IRA for a while now. So it was extremely humbling for me to start talking to you. And then I also wonder to this moment why you invited me to your podcast, but happy to do it. And when it comes to investing, I mean, angel investing, it really is about having that access to deals, because you can go, there are some platforms that do it, but you're not always going to find the best deals in those platforms. The best deals often happen, in a bar amongst friends that find out that there's this investment going on. So that is actually, something that it's not necessarily good, right? It's a problem of private markets, and it's a problem that not a lot of people have access to those private markets. And then if they find out about it, then there are restrictions for investors. But for those who can invest, I would strongly encourage them to start going to the entrepreneurial communities. And that can be incubators, that can be, the entrepreneurship clubs in your local university. It can be just reaching out to other angel investors who are looking for new co-investors, right? But it comes down to asking for help and just being vocal about what you want. Someone told me, like, if you want to do something, make sure that most people know you want to do that, because then when the opportunity presents itself, they'll think of you, right?
So smart.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So definitely raising that flag, I want to participate.
So Miguel, the answer why you on this show is easy and obvious. You are yourself an entrepreneur. You have made your own way. You have carved your own path. And you are a perfect example of the fact that it takes a village for all of us to get this done. Your village happened to be the world. For some of us, it's just a city and a zip code. But thank you, sir, for spending the time and sharing your wisdom and your experiences with us on the Altogether Show.
It's been an honor, Eric. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
A message from our sponsor, Alto IRA. Retirement in America is broken, and Alto revolutionizes retirement investing by providing access to investment opportunities beyond the public markets. It's online, automated, and simple. Plus, it's cost-effective. You don't have to be rich to invest in alternatives. Get started today at altoira.com.